How you guys doing? Nice to see you. My name's Ryan, one of the pastors. I'm going to teach the Bible this morning. We're lately studying the book of Romans. It's in the New Testament, and it's like the Mount Everest of the Bible. Like, it's the theological summit that scrapes outer space, and from there you can see the whole landscape of the Bible below. And Paul, the author, at this point in his career, he's a veteran. And so he's standing on the summit, and he's pointing out features of the biblical story to people, to two different groups of people that he actually knows pretty well. He's got his friends who are Jews who believe in Jesus. They're from a Jewish background. And he's got friends who are not Jews. They're Gentiles, but they also believe in Jesus. And these two different backgrounds were starting to cause friction for this young church in the imperial capital city of Rome. In fact, one of the reasons Paul's even writing this letter at all is that he wants to thoughtfully appeal to both of these groups, believers from a Jewish background, believers from a non-Jewish background, and show them how the work of the Messiah actually heals the divisions festering between them. And not in a sort of like, let's paper over it and smile and just pretend to get along sort of way, but in like a deep, principled, lasting sort of way. So today we're in Romans chapter 4, and in this chapter, Paul squares up to one of the biggest sticking points for his Jewish friends, which is the whole issue of, hey, we're part of Abraham's family, like we have his bloodline, and not really sure how Jesus fits into that whole question. What we need to know here is that the world of the Bible, the ancient world, was really interested in bloodlines. Your shot in life was, to a large extent, predetermined by the stock you come from. Who are your parents? Who are your ancestors? Society, most ancient societies, are very much this big pyramid with a hierarchy with the royal family at the top, and at the bottom, a broad base of serfs and slaves, and you are born into your role. There's no social mobility such that we enjoy in our culture. This is why this is hard for us to appreciate, because one of the basic principles of a modern liberal democracy like the United States is that the accident of birth, whatever culture you're from, whatever race you're from, does not shift. Everybody's equal before the law. So the whole like random lottery of birth has been factored out theoretically in our culture. But we need to know when we're listening to the Bible, we're listening in on a culture for whom family pedigree matters a lot. It matters a lot, which means that one of the most jarring features of the early Christian movement from Go was that it called bloodlines into question, specifically Jewish bloodlines. For example, we don't know a lot about the guy named John the Baptizer, who's Jesus' cousin, and he inherits his ministry from him. But one of the things we do know about John is that he pushed this button, and it really irritated people. He says this in Matthew chapter 3 to his Jewish listeners. He says, "Don't presume to say to yourself, well, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham." Translation, God isn't impressed with your Abrahamic DNA. Like, that's the easy part. What God is impressed with is a faithful, obedient life. Or what about this very sharp saying of Jesus that many would have heard as a slap on the face? Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 8 to his Jewish friends. "I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. While the sons of the kingdom, the sons of Abraham, you who are born into this thing, will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Translation, you don't get an inside track with God just because you were born into a godly family. That's not how it works. Jesus is undercutting that sort of family privilege. He says it's a false security. By the way, given our own cultural dynamics today, some of you may be wondering, isn't that like anti-Semitic, all this stuff? Can you even say that? No, it's not anti-Semitic, and here's why. It's Semites who are saying it. In much of the Bible, guys, what we're actually doing is we're listening in on an in-house family debate over what is the essence and the mission of this family of Abraham. Does that make sense? It's an in-house debate. If that's anti-Semitic, then I guess guys like Moses and David and Isaiah are raging anti-Semites. They're not. Actually, the Bible has a tradition of self-critique. of the people of God holding up a mirror to themselves and saying, wow, this ain't a good look. Something's got to shift here. So in Jesus' day, the first century of the Common Era, there were all sorts of Jewish splinter groups pointing the finger at other Jewish splinter groups saying, you're not real children of Abraham, we are. It's just one big happy family, right? That's what they were doing. For example, if you come sometime with us to Israel, one of the places we'll visit is the ancient ruins of Qumran in the Judean wilderness, where a bunch of Jewish monks hid their library in secret caves and never came back for their library. They're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when you read the scrolls today, you are introduced to a group of people who saw themselves as uniquely the children of light. And all those other Jewish groups, especially those priests up the hill in Jerusalem, the big shots in the temple, those are the perverse children of darkness. These are Jews saying this about each other. We're the real children of Abraham, and you're a fake. So the upshot then, what we need to know is that in that day, there was something of a paternity dispute going on. People saying, how do we know who are the real offspring of Abraham? And here's the kicker. In today's passage, Romans 4, Paul is going to insert himself into that heated debate and say, I'll tell you how you know. He's going to give us, and this is our title for today, he's going to give us a theological paternity test. Here's how you know if you're actually part of this family or not. And so let's get into it. Romans chapter 4, verse 1, right away he starts circling around this issue. He says in verse 1, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh? He's our ancestor. Why? If we're going to make sense of what it means to be children of Abraham, then we got to go back and think about what made him special at all. And so Paul is going to get right into that. He's thinking about Abraham. Verse 2 and 3, he says, for if Abraham was justified, if he was made right with God by works, that is, works of Torah, keeping the law, well, then he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, in that last little bit with the quotation marks around it, Paul is pulling directly from the Old Testament book of Genesis, which is where we find Abraham's story. And actually, guys, if we're going to understand Paul's flow of thought today, which we're going to try, it's really important that we go back and get a sense of the highlights of Abraham's story. Like, if we don't know those mile markers in Abraham's story, none of this is going to make any sense. So let's look at Abraham's journey of faith. We're going to look at a few quick sort of high watermark moments. First, in Genesis 12, Abraham comes on the scene. God calls him to leave his father's house, and he's told by God he's going to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. This is fundamental for biblical theology, that the scope is global. Because although the Bible from that point forward will be largely zooming in on the fate of this one family, the global scope is always there in the background. It was always God's plan to bless the whole world. Said another way, in the Old Testament, the relationship between Israel and the nations, that's not a marginal issue. That's like the main frame. It's a major issue. So that's Genesis 12. Abraham then pushes off into the unknown on a journey with God. And in Genesis 15, a few chapters later, he believes God's promise to him that he will have as many children as the stars. It's an amazing passage. Abraham's camping out in the desert, and God says, hey, why don't you come outside your tent? Have a look up. You ever gone camping like out in the desert or like in the mountains away from the light pollution of cities? You know, and at nighttime it's just like, poof, someone flips the lights. The sky is packed with galaxies in the Milky Way. It's amazing. God tells Abraham, you're going to have as many kids as that. And Abraham's an old guy past his prime, and he doesn't have any kids yet. But he says, you know what, God, I think you're good for your word. And that's where we get the important verse that Paul quotes, Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Righteousness there means being in the covenant with God, which is why in the remainder of that passage, Genesis 15, God and Abraham make, or more technically, they cut a covenant with each other. It's actually kind of a graphic passage. You got to go back and read it sometime. But what happens next? We're moving quickly here. What happens next in Abraham's story? Well, one of the things we learn in the Bible over and over is that we are often most spiritually vulnerable right after a big spiritual high. Yes. It's often right after the big God moment when we are most prone to fall right on our face. Like right at the finish line, that's where the snake is in the grass. So what happens to Abraham? In Genesis 16, next chapter, he and his wife, Sarah, go wobbly in their faith, and they decide to take matters into their own hands. Well, we'll help God a little bit. This is the Hagar debacle. Go read it sometime. Sarah says, well, I can't seem to get pregnant, so I'm going to let Abraham shack up with my servant girl, and I'll count the kid as mine. Does that work out very well? No, it's a mess. It's like reality TV housewives. It doesn't go well. And so then this failure means that God decides to recut the covenant with Abraham in the next chapter. This is Genesis 17, where we read about the covenant of circumcision, a physical symbol on the body, on the very organ, in fact, through which the problem children would be produced, the promised children. I said problem children. This is a slip of the tongue of a new dad. All these problem children. My life used to be awesome. No, just kidding. I love my daughter. I love my daughter. Two and a half months. Very special. Getting lots of sleep. Okay. We were talking about circumcision. Don't think about it too hard. It just means I trust God. Okay, let's move on. So to summarize Abraham's story, we got to know two things. Two things are really important. First of all, it was always global in scope. It's always aimed at blessing all the families of the earth. The trajectory is multicultural. That's really important for Paul. It's really important for Christians. Second, it's important from Paul's argument in Romans, that God welcomes Abraham into the covenant in chapter 15 of Genesis by faith before chapter 17 and the circumcision. That order is extremely important for Paul. He's going to make a big point out of it. Because in the Jewish thought world of his day, one of the works of Torah that was incumbent on all men was to be circumcised. And Paul, reading Genesis, says, yeah, but the covenant was made by faith before circumcision or anything else came into the picture. Therefore, faith must be enough. You following me? Yes. Okay, so let's read a few more verses then. We've got this story now fresh in our mind. Paul goes on. He says, now to the one who works, who does the works of Torah, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. To the one who does not work, but believes in him, who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. He's hitting this same theological gong once more. What matters with God is faith, not the works that point to true faith, the works that are evidence of faith. And by the way, is Paul just making this up? Is this a new doctrine that he's just going to teach everybody? Not at all. We would only think that if we have a very cartoonish version of the Bible, which some people actually have. They have a very overly simplified, here's the Bible in a nutshell. The Old Testament is about legalism. The New Testament is about faith. So there it is. That's the Bible in a nutshell. Old Testament legalism, bad. New Testament faith, good. That's a very, very thin, shallow reading of the Bible. Actually, when we read the Torah closely, the first 5 books, one of the things we see is it is designed to cultivate faith. That's what it's meant to do. I want to give you a sense of how this theme of faith or belief appears in the Torah. We're going to do a quick survey, and the structure is to notice the passages leading up to Mount Sinai, when the Torah is given by God, and then the passages leading away from Mount Sinai. There's sort of an upslope and a downslope within this 5-book structure. Let's take a quick look. So in Genesis 15:6, we already saw this. Abraham believed the Lord. He counted it to him as righteousness, covenant standing. Great. Now in Exodus 4, there's going to be 4 passages here, and this is the story of Moses. And he's at the burning bush, and God is commissioning him to go rescue the people. But Moses says, they're not going to believe me. Exodus 4:1. Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say the Lord did not appear to you. A couple verses later, God reassures Moses, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in order that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has appeared to you. Verses 8 and 9. And if they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first signs, they may believe the latter signs. God is trying to cultivate belief. And if they will not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So Moses goes back to Egypt. He tells them, God sent me, and what happens? End of chapter 4. This is what happens. And the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. So this whole chapter is about getting God's people to believe that he's the real deal and that Moses is actually from God. Well, we fast forward, there's all these plagues. God miraculously jailbreaks this whole population. And on the far end of the Red Sea, they're standing on the shore. What happens? What does the Bible tell us? Exodus 14:31. After crossing the sea, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. It's working. They're sharing Abraham's belief. And then a few chapters later in Exodus 19, at the foot of Mount Sinai, we're about to get the Ten Commandments. We're about to get the Torah. This is what we find. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe you forever. So it seems to be working, and we're about to get the Torah. But what happens on the far side of that, the downslope, on the second half of the Pentateuch? Let's find out. Well, in Numbers 14, we read this. The Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done for them? And then in Numbers 20, we learn not even Moses is exempt from this failure. Numbers 20, the Lord said to Moses and his brother Aaron, because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, the indictment continues against this failure of faith. Deuteronomy 1, in spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 9, when the Lord sent you from Kadesh Barnea, saying, go up and take possession of the land that I have given you, then you rebelled against the commandment of the Lord your God and did not believe him or obey his voice. There's more, but we'll stop here. We've seen enough now. The question is, did the law fix the problem? The answer is no, it didn't. And so we can summarize this feature of the Bible this way. We can say it this way. The Torah aims to produce faith, but anticipates its own failure to do so. This is a key turn in understanding how the law and Torah fits in with Christianity. The Torah aims to produce faith, but anticipates its failure to do so. Said another way, the Torah predicts the need for something more than Torah to come good on its promise. And this is the inner tension Paul is picking up on. He's not making stuff up. He's a good reader of the Bible. He's observed from Torah that faith was always the family mark. The family, oh, they've got that family nose. They got the same hair. It's like you look like you're part of the same family. It's faith that marks out Abraham's people, yet Torah fails to produce and sustain that. And Paul is saying, right, and it's only through the Messiah who fulfills Torah that faith becomes possible, not just for the Jewish people, but for all people, Jew and Gentile alike. So this is the real paternity test, proving who's in and who's out. It's faith. Remember, like we've all been taking COVID tests, or we used to. There's like the two lines. You just swab your nose, and then you wait 15 minutes, and it hurts. And then there's the control line that tells you if the thing's working. And then if that second test line comes up, that's, well, you got COVID now. Sort of think about that. The good infection of faith that makes that red line go, the top one, that's belief in God. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes sense in my mind. Here's the point. Abraham is messing with Paul. Boy, I'm just really killing it this morning. Paul He's in the Bible, I promise. I'll get out my hanky. All right. Paul is messing with the categories of his Jewish friends who believe in Jesus, but still think that it is also still necessary to be circumcised, to keep kosher, to keep Sabbath, to do these works of the law. And Paul is saying, not that those things are bad, but that they are not necessary. Does that make sense? And what is the basis of his argument? That the Torah itself shows that covenant is established by faith alone before any of that other stuff came into the picture. I know this is a lot to absorb, especially when the preacher can't get his words right. But at some point, every Christian has to try to get into the guts of this stuff and understand how this works. At some point, we have to figure out how these things operate. And so Paul is going to give us a good summary of what we've said so far. So in verses 9 through 12, he says this. So we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. Okay, good. We've talked about that. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he was circumcised? And he's talking about Genesis 15 and 17. This is just the order we were looking at. He says it was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received that sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith when he was still uncircumcised. Now the next question is why? Why would the story go like that? Why would God orchestrate things like that? He answers. He says the purpose was to make him the father of all who would believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. He's talking about Gentiles here, so that Abraham can be the father of Gentiles, and, verse 12, to make him the father of the circumcised, the Jews, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So, upshot, as we saw in Genesis, the trajectory of the Bible is always towards a multi-ethnic people of God, Jew plus Gentile, and Paul is saying that is now happening through Jesus the Messiah. So I love that last little bit. It talks about walking in the footsteps of the faith of Abraham. Do you ever see this old famous poem about two sets of footprints in the sand? And this guy's looking back on his life, his walk with God, and he imagines it as two sets of footprints along the beach, you know? And the guy is puzzled because he looks and he says, well, hard seasons of life, I only see one set of footprints there. God must have abandoned me. I was all alone. And at the end of the poem, God says, no, my child, you've got it backwards. It's not that I abandoned you, it's that I was carrying you. The one set of footprints are mine. It's a beautiful poem. I really love it. But there's another poem that I actually like a little bit more. And it's also deeply spiritual. It's not called Footprints in the Sand. It's called Butt Prints in the Sand. Every sermon has to have a poem. This is my poem. It's called Butt Prints in the Sand. I didn't write this, but it's pretty deep. Let me read this to you. Go ahead and put it up there, please. One night, I had a wondrous dream. One set of footprints there was seen, the footprints of my precious Lord, but mine were not along the shore. But then some stranger prints appeared, and I asked the Lord, what have we here? Those prints are large and round and neat, but Lord, they are too big for feet. My child, he said in somber tones, for miles I carried you alone. I challenged you to walk in faith, but you refused and made me wait. You disobeyed, you would not grow. The walk of faith you would not know. So I got tired, I got fed up, and there I dropped you on your butt. Because in life, there comes a time when one must fight and one must climb. One must rise and take a stand, or leave their butt prints in the sand. Now, according to my original research, that was Psalm 151 that almost made it in the Bible. It got the last revision. They said, you know, it's a little iffy. At some point in life, the poem is saying, this brilliant work of literature, that if we don't use our faith, if we don't walk in faith, the Almighty's going to drop us on our keister and say, well, have it your way. I'm going. Now, we've used this word a lot today so far, faith. We haven't yet defined it. What does it even mean? What would it even look like in our life day to day? Let's talk about that. There are actually two components of faith. They overlap, they synergize, but they are also separate. It's a little equation. We could say it like this, that faith equals a worldview plus a lifestyle. We're talking about this. Faith is the combination of a certain worldview with a certain lifestyle. Let's talk about these terms one at a time. First of all, faith is a worldview. It involves having an overarching map of reality with, at the center, a creative, powerful, loving, holy God. It's an intellectual sort of thing. In fact, there's a Jewish legend that the reason God chose Abraham at all is that Abraham was a philosopher who saw through the pagan polytheism, the many gods of his culture. Abraham was the guy who landed on the correct monotheistic worldview, and God said, oh, good, I can work with that guy. He's actually on the right track. Now, in our day, of course, the intellectual cultural pressure is all in the other direction. It's not towards belief in many gods, it's towards belief in no gods. The modern Western culture tells us all the time that only naive children would believe there's a God. Because well-adjusted adults, obviously, we believe in science. We don't follow the footsteps of faith, we follow the footsteps of data. Now, we don't have time this morning to get into the weeds here, so I'll just cut to the chase. This modern bias, this modern prejudice against God is total propaganda. Like, it's sheer bunk. Science is a beautiful thing. Biology, chemistry, physics, the whole bit, astronomy, amazing. But the God of the Bible is the Lord of science. The God of the Bible is the creator and sustainer of the universe, the whole shebang. And interestingly, many leading scholars in science today, at the front end of research, not your dilettantes on the fringe who are science writers, your legitimate scientists, are increasingly open to the reality of God today. And do you know why? It's because things like mysteries like quantum electric fields, quantum energy fields, the mystery of human consciousness, which we're all experiencing right now, are just too strange and too beautiful to discount the possibility of a God. In fact, we recently did an episode on the Deeper Bible podcast, our church podcast, which is called The Part of the Brain That Believes in God. And did it together with actually my brother-in-law. He's a physician. His name's Paul. And we talked about recent findings in brain science that show that belief is not an inferior form of knowledge for children, sort of the junior varsity team. Belief is an advanced and vital and completely legitimate form of knowing anything about the world. So I put a link in your app notes for that episode if that's of interest. But suffice it to say, a worldview with God at the center is very legit, very intellectually respectable. But it's only part of what the Bible means by faith. There's that second component, and it's just as important. Faith is a lifestyle, a mode of living, a way of being in this world that bleeds through in all of our actions, in all of our attitudes. And what's the pulse? What's the defining feature of it? It is a radical, exclusive trust in God. That's the essence of a lifestyle of faith, from our marriage to our money, to our unspoken fears and hopes, to the questions about our future that are not resolved, to our own identity, to our eternal destiny. All of these things we put with God. Faith means trusting God when it doesn't even make sense to trust in God. Or I like how Dr. King once put this. He says, faith is taking the first step even when you don't see the whole staircase. You don't see the top. You don't know how long this is going to take. You don't even know where it leads, but you start. This is what Abraham did in his life. When God called him from the security of his own family, God didn't tell him where he was going. He just said, go and I'll show you as you get there. Why wouldn't God give him a map? It's because God wanted to shape Abraham, needed to shape him into someone who exclusively trusts God, period. I mean, the paternity test for his future global family would be faith alone. It would have to then be highly developed in the man himself, in the father of faith. And you know what? God needs to mold and shape us in a similar fashion if we are going to be real children of Abraham. It's not enough to just have a Christian worldview, to have ninja apologetic skills. Like, cool, that's fine, but what God really wants are men and women who radically transfer their trust from themselves to Him. And in order to do that, God often has to put us on a life path that is similar to Abraham's, where each step forward is not at all clear. I can't see around the corner. I can only see a step at a time. There's another Jewish tradition that in the story of Abraham in the Bible, God takes him through 10 tests, each one harder than the last. Look it up. It's a thing. The 10 tests of Abraham. Why would God do that for this man who trusts him? It's because his trust did not exempt him from testing. His trust was refined and developed by testing. Does that make sense? And it's that way in our life too. Life in many ways is like a spiral. And we move like this. Each test is a bit more extreme, but we circle around. In our life, we'll go through Obedience 101. God says, I want you to trust me with this. Obedience 101. It's really hard. Finally passed the test. Maybe you failed it a couple times, eventually passed the test. Guess what? You're going to circle around to Obedience 201. Same thing, but the stakes are higher. It's a little more advanced. It's a little more complex, but it's the same move. Are you going to trust me, or are you going to trust yourself or some other? And then you'll get to Obedience 301 and Obedience 401. It's a course of a lifetime in which we learn to let go and transfer all trust to Him. So faith then, to summarize, has like these two strands side by side, almost like a DNA double helix. It's a worldview and it's a lifestyle, and these reinforce, they mutually support each other. This is how it works. The more you trust God with your life, the more you actually follow Him, the more your eyes are opened to the ways of God in the world. But then the more your eyes are open to the ways of God in the world, the easier it becomes to actually let go of your own little plans and your own little resources and abandon yourself to His eternal plans and His eternal resources. So the worldview and the lifestyle mutually accelerate. This is what it means to be part of Abraham's family, to have the DNA of faith. Now, some of you might be saying, that sounds nice, but you don't understand my situation. The things I've been trusting God for, that I thought God spoke over my life, but they're just too far gone, you know? They're not really going to happen. There's no happy ending for me here. Well, interestingly, I think Abraham would have been tempted to say the exact same thing. Let's read a few more verses and how where did his faith develop? So Paul continues, and I'm in verse 18, talking about Abraham still. In hope, he believed against hope. He's in a hopeless situation, but he says, I'm going to hope anyways. And what was he hoping for? That he should become the father of many nations. As he had been told, so shall your offspring be like the stars. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness, literally the deadness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. The part that really hits me here, the part that tells us how he did it. How did he pull himself up from the basement of doubt to this elevated place of trust? How did he do it? The secret is there in verse 20. It says, he grew strong in faith. It didn't happen all at once. It was a process. He grew strong in faith as he gave glory to God. That's the key. As he gave glory to God, even when everything around him was very inglorious. By the way, you may remember from Romans chapter 1, the beginning of this letter, where Paul is describing What went wrong in the world? Where does human sin come from? What is the first slippage point that leads us to a place we don't want to go? And you know what he identified as the main problem, the beginning point of sin? It is a failure of worship. It's a failure to give thanks. It is a decentering of God and a refusal to give him glory. So it's not at all accidental that here in chapter 4, Abraham is reversing that. And he is giving God glory. God is dealing with the problem of sin through this covenant that he's establishing with Abraham and his family. In fact, a wonderful Bible study you should do sometime puts Romans 1 right alongside Romans 4, the mechanism of sin against the mechanism of faith. And you'll see there's all sorts of Easter eggs in there. Paul has deliberately shown how Abraham is systematically rewinding what goes wrong in sin. It's amazing. But let's come back to this core insight. I think there's something here for us. He grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God. And I can illustrate this, I think, best with a story. It's a story that still kind of haunts me. I don't fully get it, but I'll tell it to you. So as many of you know, I lived in Israel for several years after college. I lived in Jerusalem, and I worked at a place that does heart surgeries for children that come from poor places in the Middle East, no hospitals, bring them to Israel, and they get an open heart surgery in an Israeli hospital. And here's a pencil sketch that a friend of mine did, who's an artist, just of a typical mother who would come with her child. They'd be in country for like 2 months. And this was my reality. I lived at this place for a long time. And so here's a picture of me with a little boy named Arish, who's from Iraq. This is before surgery. And then they would go to surgery, and here's what it would look like after surgery. I actually got to watch a whole open heart surgery one time, like 5 hours. This little girl named Fatima. It was amazing. Most of the kids make it. Some of them don't. And early on in my time, there was a little boy named Ahmed who came from Iraq for heart surgery, and he and I hung out a lot together. And we'd play soccer together and coloring books and bang on the guitar, just passing the time, waiting for surgery. And when I knew Ahmed, I was still in school. I wasn't full-time at the clinic. So one day, after class, I came by to spend some time with Ahmed. When I got there, I was told through tears, "Oh, Ryan, Ahmed died last night." I was just like, I was stunned. I was like, I just hung out with him yesterday. What happened? And so they told me the story. He, last night, in the middle of the night, just started to decline, just started going downhill. They rushed him into the van, rushed him to the hospital in Tel Aviv. It's a full hour away. And all along this dark road, I mean, he's just going down and down, and they're just like, oh my God, like, this kid is dying in front of our eyes. Are we going to make it to the hospital? And here's the part that haunts me, the part that I still think about, that in the car is this precious little boy is expiring. Do you know what my coworkers decided to do during that moment? They decided to sing hymns of praise. They decided to worship God. Because what else was there to do in the middle of their helplessness, in the middle of their fear, in their radical powerlessness? What else is there to do but to say, God, our lives are in your hands. Like Abraham, looking at the situation and seeing everything around me is dying. All the promises I had banked on are unraveling before my eyes. What is the response of faith? To give God glory anyways. To worship him anyways, because he's no less God in the storm. And you say to me, well, Ryan, that sounds nice. But their singing didn't fix the problem. The little boy still died. And that's irreversible. But is it? Is death really irreversible? I don't know. According to the Bible, according to Romans 4, it seems that the hallmark of faith, the real paternity test that we are really Abraham's children, is an ironclad, unshakable belief that God is able to make dead things alive. That is where our faith resides. Listen to the final verses of today's passage. Paul says this, still speaking of Abraham. That is why his faith was counted as righteousness. And those words, it was counted to him, were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him who raised from the dead Jesus, our Lord, who was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. So what do we learn from this? Guys, this is so very important, that real faith is not like abstract good vibes, a preference for optimistic attitudes in the presence of challenge. That's self-help stuff. That's only marginally useful. No, here's what we learn, that faith finds its focus in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That is where it is laser focused. Faith finds its focus in the God who is faithful beyond the grave. It is specific. It is not vague and sort of, I'm just trusting. No, it is based on Easter Sunday morning in Jerusalem. And if our God can conquer death, there's nothing he can't conquer. If our faith is in this God, then there's nothing in life or death that we should be afraid of. A Christian can handle anything life throws at you. Why? Because of faith. Because of this mysterious DNA of a worldview and a lifestyle that is based on God, which has discovered an inner secret about God's reality. And you know what it is? That death ain't the end of the story for those who put their trust in the God who makes all things new. Death is not the end of the story for those who put their trust in the God who makes all things new. Faith finds its focus in the resurrection of the Messiah, Jesus Christ.